All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. This is the Science and Values in Climate Risk Management webinar series. I'm Casey Helgeson from the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute. I'm one of the co-organizers of the series, along with Nancy Tuana, Klaus Keller, and Rob Nicholas. It's a series that is supported by Penn State's Rock Ethics Institute and also Center for Climate Risk Management. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the format of the webinar. I'll give you some instructions about how to participate, and then I'll introduce the speaker and hand over the floor. So let me introduce our speaker. Dale Jameson is the founding director of environmental studies and professor of environmental studies and philosophy at New York University, where he is also affiliated professor of law, medical ethics, and bioethics, and director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection. He's also held visiting appointments at many places, including NCAR, Cornell, Princeton, Stanford, Oxford, and King's College London. He's written, I counted 5 books and many, many articles and book chapters in the areas of ethics and environmental philosophy. In 2016, he was awarded the William R. Freudenberg Lifetime Achievement Award by the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences. His most recent book with Michael Oppenheimer, Naomi Oreskes, and others is called Discerning Experts, the Practices of Scientific Assessment for Environmental Policy. And he's speaking to us today on the topic of the misunderstood risks of climate change. Welcome, Dale. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Casey. And I would like to thank everyone for showing up for this event on such a strange and stressful day for many people. I also regret that I can't be with you out in State College. My previous visits have been remarkably rewarding, since you really have, I think, one of the iconic communities, one of the rare communities where science and ethics and values in the environment really get mixed up in a way where any visit to State College is one in which I have learned an enormous amount, and it's not quite the same talking to you over Zoom. I also want to say that the format today is a little bit odd, and I think will be difficult for some of you in particular. I don't have any slides, and the reason for that is because the material that I want to discuss with you is material where slides not only wouldn't help, I think they would actually make it more difficult for you to concentrate on what I'm saying, because you'd sort of be looking at words while hearing words, and there's nothing you'd be looking at that would be making anything any more clear or transparent than what I'm trying to say. I'll try to compensate for that by being relatively brief. So 30 minutes at the most. I hope less than that, but we'll see. So, all right then. So what I want to do today is to discuss some of the misunderstood risks of climate change. Now, I want to be clear about what I mean by misunderstood. I don't mean things that no one else knows or has ever discovered or anything like that. We can know relevant truths about an issue and still misunderstand it. Misunderstanding usually involves ignorance or false beliefs, but it can also involve failing to appreciate the salience and significance and importance of what, in fact, we already know. And information-rich environments can make it more difficult to grasp the significance of some of what we know by obscuring what matters most in a sea of trivia. And a misinformation-rich environment can make it difficult to know even what to believe in the first place. Furthermore, because of our deeply human ability to compartmentalize, we can comfortably exist in logically distinct and even contradictory worlds without feeling much pressure to bring them together. So, for example, I may vote for my Republican congressman who looks, talks, and acts like a responsible congressman, while decrying the climate change denying policies of the Republican majority of which he is a part. So what I want to suggest today is that the significance of some of the most important risks of climate change, those that may have the greatest impacts on our lives, are misunderstood in these ways that I have briefly described. It's not that we're unaware of them, but rather that their significance is obscured by rhetoric, uncertainty, misinformation, denial, and various features and bugs of our cognitive systems. And as a result, these risks are often ablated in our thought and action. Now, I'm certainly not going to explain the rudiments of climate change to this audience, but I do want to give a kind of historical reconstruction because it's important for appreciating why I think certain risks are misunderstood. And I want to begin this story with the idea that anthropogenic climate change has been discussed more or less as a fact since the early 20th century with the work of Svante Arrhenius. Now, we can sort of drill down into the history of science and we can talk about various debates that occurred in the first half of the 20th century, but really Arrhenius himself spoke of climate change as a fact. And it was only in the last half of the 20th century, and this I think is the important point, that climate change was clearly seen as negative, even though some dissenters remained. The first half of the 20th century, even people who accepted climate change or anthropogenic climate change still tended to see it as a net positive or at least as mixed. But by the second half of the century, clearly seen as a negative, although there were some dissenters. And I think one way of marking the sort of current understanding of climate change and its impacts is to go back to the 1979 report of the National Academy of Sciences. And in the foreword to that report, Victor Suomi wrote, a wait and see policy may mean waiting until it's too late. Now, in the United States, at least, climate change was initially seen as a technical subject rather than as a moral or political issue. Economic perspectives dominated the policy discussion, and concern, there was really as much concern in the 1970s and 1980s and even into the 1990s. There was as much concern about responding too quickly or too aggressively to climate change. The optimal path was to reap the benefits of emitting carbon as long as possible, while pushing reductions into the future when they would be cheaper to achieve and the damages to be averted would be greater. But policy does not respond directly to the curves drawn by economists. And the emitting has continued far beyond what most economists would consider rational. Now, one reason for this, I think, there are many reasons, but one reason is that already by 1989, the fossil fuel industry had organized against climate action. Well, the first highly visible climate-specific environmental advocacy group, 350.org, was formed only in 2007. In 2008, Obama was elected president on a platform that included climate action, but his first year in office saw the failure of both his climate legislation and the Copenhagen Climate Conference. He responded by taking executive action to reduce emissions, but this proved vulnerable to court challenges and a change of administration. Obama's presidency was capped by the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, which was signed to great acclaim, but really was only a modest revision of the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change and did not include binding commitments or sanctions. And in 2017, Trump signaled American withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, which occurred, in fact, actually yesterday. Now, 2018 marked a turning point in the global politics of climate change with Greta Thunberg's school strike and the rise of such activist groups as Extinction Rebellion. And I think one particularly important moment in this was Greta Thunberg's 2019 address to world leaders at the UN Climate Action Summit. And probably most of you have seen it. I'm not going to bother to quote the words here, but these are remarkably moving and acting words. You are failing us. We are betrayed. We will never forgive you. This is the kind of language that Thunberg was using. So now this brief historical story that I have been telling is one in which climate change begins as a scientific issue with a technical solution, the economic solution, and increasingly becomes a public issue with no conventional political solution. And this gives rise to activism and increasingly apocalyptic action. Now, apocalyptic thinking around climate change has been a persistent but submerged theme. In fact, those scientific reports from the 1980s focused on famine, floods, and droughts, although they tended to avoid such direct and colorful language. And with recent fires in Australia and the American West, hurricanes in the Caribbean, and pandemic everywhere, these risks, which I call the biblical risks of climate change, I think have really been brought to the surface. Fire, flood, famine, drought, wind, and plague are the archetypal fears that figure in the mythologies and sacred texts of most cultures. People have responded to them by submission to God, casting out demons, or embracing a cycle of destruction and rebirth. It's not surprising that the Paris Climate Agreement or even the Green New Deal are pale substitutes for these archetypal human responses. But beyond the biblical risks are what I call the existential risks of climate change that are eloquently articulated in recent books and articles that have titles such as The Uninhabitable Earth, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, We're Doomed, Now What? And What If We Stopped Pretending? Now, the expert community has been largely dismissive of such texts. I think to some extent, this is sociology. These texts are authored by professional writers, journalists, and humanities professors, rather than climate scientists or policy analysts. The substantive criticism is that these authors exaggerate the risks of climate change, plunging people into despair and apathy, rather than motivating them to act. Yes, we should not exceed a 2 degrees centigrade warming, but better 3 than 4, and better 4 than 5. Climate catastrophe comes in degrees. Apocalypse does not. However, the risk with which these authors are primarily concerned is not the extinction of the species, Homo sapiens, but rather the extinction of our cultures, civilizations, and ways of life. That is why an appeal to one of the most salient features of Homo sapiens, its ability to adapt, does not extinguish these concerns. 3 years after the Allies entered the smoking ruins of Berlin, the German economic miracle was underway. 15 years after Roberto Rossellini depicted the daily struggle for food and shelter in his amazing movie, Rome, Open City, 15 years later, Federico Fellini was portraying the jadedness of Roman life in his film, La Dolce Vita. Now, in some way, these stories may provide reason for hope, but they don't compensate for the losses. Imagine someone comforting an inhabitant of Warsaw in 1939 by telling her that the horror that was being unleashed on her city would eventually be reversed. Within a few years, happy people would once again be in the streets, though she personally would not be able to recognize much of her city or understand its way of life. Well, this might give her some consolation. It would not compensate for the horror that was befalling her. For beyond the suffering and death, there is the question of meaning. What we want is not just biological continuity, but the persistence of our values, cultures, and ways of life. What makes climate change an existential risk is the way that it remakes the world, ruptures our time horizons, erodes our commitments to long-term projects, and damages our hopes for our children and their futures. Climate change is an existential threat, not to the existence of the species, but to virtually everything else we care about. As for apathy and despair, these authors implore us to mitigate the damage as far as possible, but their primary aim is to shock us with the severity of the crisis, as was my primary aim in my book that had the rather provocative title, Reason in a Dark Time: Why the Struggle to Stop Climate Change Failed and What It Means for Our Future, written already in 2014. These authors want us to understand that we are already being engulfed by profound change, and the radical challenge that we now face is how to live through this time of transformation. Survival in any form depends on accepting the depth of the crisis and the profundity of the loss. As writers, rather than scientists or policymakers, they are primarily addressing people who may experience what has been called climate panic, but are not moved by indifference curves or figures reflecting the Earth's carbon budget. Now, the existential risk of climate change engages one of the most primal fears of humanity, the fear of chaos and disorder. And climate change threatens chaos and disorder, and this quickly turns into the political risk of climate change. And so the second risk I want to talk about is the political risk. And I want to frame this discussion by telling you a story, by giving you an analogy. Imagine a ship on the ocean with no destination. The goal of those on board, I'm going to call them the sailors, is to individually thrive and for the ship to be safe. The sailors, forced by circumstance, have only recently joined in this cooperative endeavor. They have different histories, skills, capacities, attitudes towards risk, and conceptions of what it is to thrive. At first, it was difficult for them to come together, but this was followed by a period of optimism and bonhomie. But that was brief. Things became difficult again, and now this. The seas are increasingly becoming rough, threatening, and unpredictable. The sailors have a general sense of where they might find calmer seas with more abundant resources, but they disagree about exactly how to get there. Few sailors think that the ship should be a democracy, but there is growing resentment against the officers. Not only have they failed to steer the ship safely, but they've taken advantage of their positions of power. In a startling turn of events, the captain of the ship has abandoned his responsibility for the ship. He says that he's been taken advantage of by the others. Other sailors are willing to step up and do more, but there's no obvious successor to the captain. The one or two sailors who have the greatest skill and competence are viewed with suspicion by many of the others. Perhaps they will use their new power even more brutally than the previous captain. Perhaps they're not as competent as they seem. Well, the sailors squabble and the seas rise. Now, I've given you an analogy to our present state with respect to climate change. Analogies are not perfect, and we would think even more dimly of the sailors than we do if they had actually created the raging seas and the conditions that forced them onto the boat in the way that we've brought about climate change. And unlike the sailors, we face two governance challenges, one among nations and one within nations. Now, Together with the Italian political theorist Marcello Di Paola, in recent years, I've argued that climate change and other problems of the Anthropocene pose risks that even the most perfect democracies may not be able to manage. The traditional vulnerabilities of democracy identified by Plato and Hobbes, the lack of governance expertise, voter ignorance, and instability, are magnified by the interlocking crises that climate change both expresses and generates. Climate change can only be managed through global cooperation, yet democracies are responsible only to their own voters. And this can give rise to weak multilateralism and even glaring indifference to those beyond their political and temporal borders. Managing climate change requires a long-term perspective, yet the time horizon of democratic decision makers is keyed to the electoral cycle. There are a large number of veto players in some representative democracies that can prevent popular policies from being enacted. For example, in the United States, the president, each House of Congress, and the Supreme Court are veto players. So are civil society actors such as political parties, unions, and organized economic interests. In 2016, 80,000 voters in 3 key states vetoed the presidential candidate who won the national popular vote. And indeed, that could happen this year as well. Another tension endemic to democracy, that between equality and expertise, takes on special significance with climate change. In a democracy, expertise is always subservient to the voice of the people. A democratic citizen can say to the expert, "You may be right, but who made you the boss about what we should do about it?" The democratic citizen can go further and say, "You may be an expert, but who made you the boss about what I should believe?" Denialism about expertise appears to be on the rise and even spilling over into conspiratorial confabulation. Recent surveys have indicated that 44% of US Republicans believe that Bill Gates is plotting to use a COVID-19 vaccination campaign as a pretext to microchip billions of people and monitor their movements. And in Australia, 1/5 of people under the age of 30 have affirmed the idea that Bill Gates actually played a role in the creation and spread of COVID. Now, what's new about denialism in the Anthropocene is not its strategy or tactics, but the technologies used to amplify it. Through social media, denialism now directly connects hundreds of millions of people, bypassing traditional intermediaries such as experts, political parties, professional journalists. And indeed, in an effort to maintain their relevance, these traditional intermediaries often seek to replicate the immediacy and excitement of social media by getting lots of Twitter followers and so on in their own communications. And as a result, the epistemological authority that comes from studied expertise, analytical thinking, systematic empirical investigation, and practices such as peer review and multiple sourcing is increasingly subordinated, even in academia, to branding and marketing. In addition to climate change, policy failures with respect to COVID and the management of the global economy are also feeding denialism. Much of the world had not recovered from the financial crisis of 2008 when the economic shutdown of 2020 occurred, stimulated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which is not yet under control. Since climate change contributes to the occurrence of pandemics, the worst may be yet to come. Mismanagement of these crises puts at risk the political legitimacy of democratic states. Two traditional sources of legitimacy are the provision of beneficial consequences, which is the utilitarian tradition for those of you who are philosophers. And the second source is consent of the governed, which is the social contract tradition. The failure of governments to successfully address problems of climate change, public health, and economic security diminishes beneficial consequences as a ground for their political legitimacy. And the fact that national governments have grown in size and complexity and are increasingly embedded in corporate, transnational, and international networks distances citizens and their expressed preferences from the laws, policies, actors, and decisions that actually govern their lives. Indeed, democratic governments may be caught in a paradox. In order to successfully address problems such as climate change, they must make robust commitments to expertise, to multilateral cooperation, to long-term planning. Yet in doing so, they move away from the direct authorizations of their citizens. Either through incompetence or treachery, democratic governments have stabbed us in the back, some think. And into this breach, authoritarians increasingly deploying this very language step. Okay, so now I'm going to draw some conclusions and maybe signal something about a way forward. So I've focused on what I regard some of the what I regard as some of the misunderstood risks of climate change. Political risks matter. Sorry, I've been focusing on existential risks and political risks. So political risks matter because the very future of liberal societies and democratic governance are in jeopardy. And existential risks matter, among other things, because they feed political risks and they threaten the very sources of meaning in our lives. So together, existential and political risks contribute to and reflect our sense of powerlessness. We cause climate change collectively, yet as individuals, we experience it as an external threat, undermining the physical and psychological conditions of our lives. And the more that climate change penetrates our consciousness, the more central these neglected risks will become, and the more insecurity and anger they will engender, or so I think. Despite this, we must go on. Now, the old environmentalism of Thoreau, Muir, Carson, and Leopold saw environmentalism as a way of life rather than as a set of solutions. And something of this spirit remains alive in people who do small things, such as turning off lights, recycling, composting, biking, and eating plant-based diets, even when experts tell them that these individual actions are ineffectual. But seeing ourselves simply as instruments for producing a more sustainable world is itself antithetical to the spirit of environmentalism. It matters who we are and how we live, not just what we bring about. This sense of agency is central to environmentalism as it historically developed in the United States. Nature teaches many lessons. Some are about joy and wonder, while others are about indifference and suffering. It is the ultimate destiny of living things to disappear into nature's maw. For thinking beings, this is a tragic fate. But it also gives them the opportunity for meaning. We will certainly die, but it matters to us how we die, when we die, and whether our living has mattered to others. In a letter to a friend written near the end of his life, Aldo Leopold wrote, quote, that the situation is hopeless should not prevent us from doing our best. This sentiment, expressed by one of environmentalism's founders, would be deplored by many of today's experts as an unempowering counsel of despair. But for Leopold, it was the opposite. The truth really can set you free and make for a new beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dale. I'm sorry you can't hear people clapping and showing their appreciation. Let's transition to some discussion and Q&A. Give people a minute to think. And again, you can either use the raise hand function and speak your question, or you can put things into the chat. I can read those, or Dale, you can read them as well. Can you see the chat? Okay.
I can see I can see something from anonymous attendee. Right. So the question is really a question about whether this critique of democracy is kind of an argument for authoritarianism, and it is not. Really, for two reasons. One is the arguments I've given here and in other places tend to focus on some of the weaknesses even of perfect democracies. But it's obvious that in the United States, I think it's not even the case that we have an imperfect democracy. I mean, democracy is yet aspirational for us. So I think you know, there's this famous anecdote, which is probably not true, but supposedly Gandhi was once asked what he thought about Western civilization. And his supposed answer was, it sounds like a good idea, somebody should try it. And I think something like that is true about democracy in the United States. We should try it and see where it leads, while recognizing that there are still real challenges for even the most perfect democratic system to deal with problems like climate change.
Well, I can jump in while we're waiting for other people to ask things. It's a common practice for speakers on climate change to tell us reasons why things are pretty bad, and to also offer some hope. In your discussion about the risks to political legitimacy and in general political risks, well, it's easy to get discouraged by that. And do you want to say anything about where that points you as far as what to do?
Well, so again, I think, so honestly, I have a hard time myself distinguishing hope from despair, if you will, because I mean, I focus on what I think is true. And I don't think you can even sort of begin to make rational decisions about what the next steps are if you don't understand the situation you're in. It's like that old joke about the first law of holes. The first law of holes is when you're in one, stop digging. And if you don't know you're in a hole, then you don't know you should stop digging. Now, I think at least two things are true about climate change. One is there will be a huge amount of adaptation that will occur. So it's not as though the economy, you know, there will be no economy, there will be no life, there will be no people falling in love, there will be no people, you know, doing all of the things that we consider valuable. It's just that it's important to recognize that the direction on which we're heading is that those lives, those kinds of lives, which individuals may experience as being good, are going to be radically disconnected from our conceptions of good lives. And I think it's important to recognize that. And for these sort of reasons of generational solidarity, among all the other reasons about biblical risks and so on, that's definitely reason to try to slow down the pace of climate change. I also think that climate change has for too long kind of been in this technocratic box, that somehow the solutions are a carbon tax, or no, it's not just a carbon tax. We actually need to prime the technological pump, or maybe it's geoengineering or something like that. And so we've really overlooked the fact that the actual fact of climate change and our inability to successfully manage it is one of the important stressors in our political system. And so we sort of need to appreciate the entwinement of those two things, just, you know, really kind of as a presupposition of how to move forward.
Thanks. A lot. Would you prefer me to pick stuff from the Q&A chat, or do you want to look at it in?
I think it's better if you do it.
Sure.
Otherwise, everyone gets to watch me,
Right, right.
reading the chat box, which is probably even less attractive than what they've already been submitted to.
So here's one from the chat, a question from Joshua Barnett. I was struck by your turn to Leopold at the end of your talk, particularly given how central grief for more than human others was to him. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what role grief and mourning might play in imagining and bringing into being more sustainable futures. Parentheses, perhaps a good follow-up to your comments just now about the relationship between hope and despair.
Yeah, so I mean, we actually know a lot about the importance of grieving in other domains, and the domain, for example, of medical ethics and sort of the work that's been done on the ethics and philosophy and psychology of end-of-life care. And we know that it is important for people to grieve, and that having space and room to grieve is important for going on, for getting by, for continuing. And I do think that with climate change, we're starting to see some grieving, but it's a very inchoate form of grieving, and there are so many mixed messages. So one of the messages that we often get from politicians in the environmental community, is, and I feel like I've been hearing this message all my life, which is the earth is endangered, but we can still save the earth, but only today. This is our last chance to save the earth, right? And that's a very confusing message, because it's a little bit like the message of making America great again. Yes, we can make America great again, but we have to do it today, or we fall off the ledge. But of course, the ledge keeps moving, and we will never return in our lifetimes to the world in which we grew up in and we formed our values in our ways of life. So so grieving is for what is lost is part of accepting what is gained and accepting change. I can't hear you, Casey.
Sorry, I was muted. I have a hand from Ted Toadvine. Do you want to go, Ted?
Hi, Dale. I guess you can't see me. I don't think I have an option for video, but I really enjoyed your talk. And I was especially interested in your conclusions. Some of the people in the audience here today are students of mine who wrote a classic essay from 1992, which we'll be discussing in class next week. And I was very struck by the way that your conclusion here seemed very continuous with the remarks that you made in that essay, when you emphasized the need to focus on character rather than on calculating outcomes. And so that suggests to me that your position on that hasn't really shifted over the last few decades. But I've always really been struck by that insight, but also really wanted to hear more about it. And you didn't tell us much more today, really, than you did then. And so I'd love to hear a few more reflections about how you see this addressing the existential and political threats that you've laid out for us. On the one hand, it seems like a move away from a kind of utilitarian way of thinking about things, as your remarks about embracing a kind of hopelessness seem to suggest at the end, with your quote from Leopold. But is there a way that this responds to the existential threat of the potential loss of meaning that climate change confronts us with?
Well, Ted, so the first thing to say is you're absolutely right that at least about me, you can't teach old dogs new tricks. So I think you're right to pick up on a continuity of thought. And the questions you ask are deep and profound, and they're the kinds of, that's the kind of discussion we would be having if I was actually able to be at college, at State College, and to have a glass of wine, and we could really talk about these things. But let me just say one thing that for students in your class and for the philosophers in the audience might seem sort of surprising, is one figure in the environmental tradition who I've tended to stay away from actually has been Aldo Leopold for lots and lots of reasons. And there's been a very particular interpretation of Leopold as someone who is real, who has a kind of normative ethic, what has been called the land ethic. And I got invited to write a new introduction for the Penguin Classics edition of a Sand County Almanac. And I took that occasion to, fall into the rabbit hole and read all the scholarship and to read all the Leopold texts and so on. And I was amazed to discover this much darker side to Leopold, if you will, and a side of Leopold that is much more aligned with what has come to be called, say, environmental virtue theory. I mean, I have some issues about what goes on under that rubric. But I do think that tradition is one, yes, it focuses on outcomes. Yes, it focuses on changing the world. There's nobody who's changed the world much more than Rachel Carson. But it always comes back to the source within the person and how to live a life in the society in which we find ourselves. So time is short. I'm going to end there, Ted, but thank you for the questions. They're very deep ones.
All right, I'm going to go back to the chat and Q&A. I'll read one just comment and then move on to another question. So there's a comment on the topic of grief from Rachel. I can grieve for myself, but I'm not willing to grieve for my 5 and 8-year-old grandnephews. Can't accept that. Comment from Mark, sorry, a question from Mark. You mentioned the idea that fear of disorder and chaos is a basic human fact. In the spirit of turning obstacles into opportunities, I wonder if we can reconceive of it as a festival of play, a source of creativity, community, empowerment, and joy that can not only fuel the transformation required to solve the problem of climate and create resilient communities to respond to its impacts, but also water the roots of meaning in human life and embody the very things that we are acting to save by growing them.
Well, I mean, I think that that's an interesting thought. And I think something like that happens. I mean, in the sense that that what is initially experienced as a loss then sort of becomes, as it were, another opportunity. So, I mean, these are bad examples, but they're the ones that come immediately to hand. I mean, so we lose the quietude of the desert, but we gain the accessibility to certain places that we wouldn't otherwise have had because of certain technological innovations, So we lose one thing, but we gain the possibility of another kind of experience. So this isn't like, so the story I'm trying to tell is not kind of a simple doom and gloom story. I'm serious about the fact that you see a movie like Rome Open City, 1945, it's hard to imagine a European society which has been more reduced to a pre-modern condition. And then 20 years later, it's espresso on the Via Veneto. People find new ways of living. They do, they do accept those losses and they move on, usually through generational change. My point really is that this is much more like death and rebirth than it is like climate change adaptation. It's, to put it another way, it's not that we're going to have managed retreat. We're going to see cataclysm on the coast and then new communities that spring up somewhere else. And the more we understand that, the better we're going to be able to manage that psychologically and otherwise.
Another question, meanwhile, keep putting stuff in through typing or raise hands. Here's one from Jenny. Climate change doesn't seem to raise even benign interest among most of the electorate. Is it really a stressor in the political system, or is this perspective of climate scholars a distraction?
So I think that that's really a great question, and it's but what I think is that the way that climate change is making itself felt is indirect. I mean, one of the things that's made climate change difficult to understand from the very beginning is if you sort of go back to papers in the early part of this millennium where the World Health Organization is doing these calculations about the number of people who will die as a result of climate change, you can believe all of those numbers, but it's also going to be the case that you will never pick up the obituary column of the New York Times and it will say, Dale Jameson died yesterday, cause of death, climate change, because climate change always expresses itself through other media. And I think that's how it's expressing itself on the political system. So, if you can get into all these issues about attribution and causation, but the fact is the kind of ecological change that we're seeing in the Western United States, for example, that is increasing the intensity and probability of these forest fires is driven by climate change, among other things. And we can go around the world and we can talk about those things. And in some parts of the world, that is setting off or at least contributing to migration flows. It's contributing to changes in livelihood. Here in the western part of the United States, it's where I am now, it's also feeding this sense of the ineffectuality of government, whether it's Democratic or Republican, about the just sort of dysfunction of the entire system. I mean, one of the friends that I grew up with here in San Diego, who told me the other day, there's no place left to go. I mean, you are in the West now, and there's a constant smoke cloud that follows you. That's the kind of pressure that I think climate change puts on the political system. It's not that, the politicians are not responding to climate change, so we don't like the political system. It's the way climate change is expressing through crises and that we're failing to manage.
Next question from the chat from Andrew. Can you unpack your comments on democracy as a governance system and its potential weakness for addressing climate change versus what could be argued as the ongoing failings of leadership, decades long and across both parties within our democracy?
Yeah, so the first thing that's complicated is, of course, is that the United States is democratic in rhetoric and maybe in aspiration, but is obviously, very far from what one would think of as an ideal democratic state. I mean, so, if you just look at the federal government, the only reliably majoritarian institution we have is the House of Representatives, not the presidency, not the Senate, not the Supreme Court. And even historically, the House of Representatives is not so reliably majoritarian because it depends a lot on how districting is done. So there's a sense in which the US is a bad case for assessing the potential of democracy to respond to problems like climate change. But since the United States is arguably the most important climate change actor in the world, it's hard to go to better functioning democracies like in societies that have proportional representation systems and don't have these non-majoritarian institutions and try to do anything that even looks like a kind of controlled experiment between the two. So the failures of the US to address climate change, first of all, have a lot to do with the anti-democratic tendencies of the system. So if you look at the survey data and so on, there's actually a lot of stuff Americans would like to do that would actually help reduce our emissions. But even if you go beyond that, when you come to the things that are really deeply important, it's just not clear how one can really talk about them in a democracy. So take a very simple thought. There's this old joke that what a gaffe is when a politician accidentally tells the truth. And in the second debate, Joe Biden spoke very awkwardly and not very eloquently, but he talked about putting the oil industry out of business, which was a campaign gaffe. But there's no question but if you're really going to deal with climate change, the oil industry will have to be out of business, whether it's in 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060, or whatever, because as long as you have a fossil fuel industry, you will have this pressure on the climate system. And it's, and that was a kind of democratic moment. I mean, that was saying something that simply cannot be said in the context of what looked like a democratic debate.
I think we've got time for probably one more. Let's go with this one. Comments and questions from the chat. Do you recommend solutions? Green New Deal, carbon pricing, Paul Hawkins?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we need to do all of those things to reduce emissions and to help us adapt. I mean, this gets into a bigger issue, but one of the problems we've had on the green side is a kind of fetishization of particular, quote, solutions. And so there was a moment, for example, where, in my world, if you said anything good about a carbon tax, the cap and traders would, my inbox would be, filled up with people advocating cap and trade, that you weren't supposed to talk about carbon taxes, right? When the obvious thing is you got to put a price on carbon. It doesn't matter so much how you do it. We tend to fetishize that. And something like that I think happened around the Green New Deal. Is the Green New Deal a good idea? Sure. But there's no reason to fetishize the Green New Deal. What we're really talking about here is essentially trying to integrate infrastructure investment, job creation, all of those kinds of economic benefits to sort of restructure the economy in a more democratic way, with also doing that in a way that's going to be more environmentally friendly, carbon neutral, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's the thought. All of that is hugely important. But we shouldn't fetishize the particular policy, much less the particular name. And we should still recognize that even if we do all of those things, the kinds of challenges and disruptions and that we're going to face in our lives are, if anything, going to become even more intense throughout this century.
Let's squeeze in one last question. I really appreciate your quote. Quote, "We caused anthropogenic climate change, yet we experience climate change as an external threat," end quote. What do you think contributes to this situation? How do we end up feeling this way?
I think part of that just simply is very, very deeply psychological. We have this, we have this folk concept, this folk idea of causation, which is, essentially me picking up the glass. And when it comes to anything that's collective, that's brought about, through tiny increments and small acts, that requires some incredibly precise accounting of our contribution to that problem. Our psychology is just not wired up to think of our agency in that way. So, there, with that issue and with many others, I think we run into sort of the deep limitations of being the kinds of animals we are, with the kinds of psychologies that we have, and responding to the kinds of challenges that we face. That's not, you just teach people, math better, or you have a different kind of political leader. I think that's just one of the design defects, for having, great apes like us, who in our numbers and with our effect on the planet, trying to figure out how to think about our own impacts.
Thanks. It is time for us to start wrapping up. There are a couple of questions left in the chat. I apologize to people who put things there that we didn't get time to. Let me briefly share my screen just to plug our next and last talk in the webinar series this semester. This was today's. The next one is next week. Greg Lusk, Michigan State University, talking about user values, climate information, and democratic institutions. Go to the Rock Ethics website to register for that. Same time as always. And that's about time. Dale, thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thank you very much, Casey. I want to say that I'm glancing at things in the chat box, and I really appreciate everything that everyone's saying. And I really want to thank Peter Stempel in particular, because there's someone out there who is as much of a European movie freak as I am. And it's always nice to know there's that kind of solidarity. So thank you all very much.
All right, thanks. And thank you to everyone. Signing off.